Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I want to talk to you about porn. And more interestingly, porn addiction. Now, this is not an addiction that I personally have any problem with, which I feel very grateful for. I do use some porn from time to time, but it's never been something that I felt like I had to keep doing. To me, it feels like psychedelics. I might use it a little bit here, maybe a little bit there, and rad, and then it kind of comes and goes, pun intended, and I don't actually think about it that much, to be honest. It's something that is just happens to be sort of, it's not a huge part of my life, which I know it can be for other people. Now that said, I've talked about this before, I do have an addictive personality, and there are other behaviors, sexual deviant behaviors that I have struggled with addiction in the past, and those were much more difficult to break. So I've always just been curious about porn addiction as someone who's also a bit of a frisky individual. I think this was really interesting. I heard this interview with this guy named Dr. K, his whole tag is the healthy gamer, and he talked about porn addiction and really opened my eyes to what porn addiction was and the motivations behind it and just some ideas around using it that I thought were really fascinating. I think porn right now is being demonized by everyone, and I'm not saying it's good, I'm not saying it's bad, but to me, as someone who I would say has a lot of addictive tendencies and behaviors, this was really interesting to learn about. And so that's what I want to dive in today. If you have struggled with porn in the past, or even if you don't, I think these were just takeaways from me that really opened my eyes to people who do struggle with porn addiction and to understand that culture better, because it's something that I have thought about. Like I said, I have friends that have struggled with this a lot. And so it really gave me a lot of empathy. Honestly, it opened my heart a little bit to those that do struggle with this because of the facts I'm about to share with you that I learned today. The first thing I wanted to share with you about porn addiction is actually about all types of addiction, which is what I learned from the psychiatrist, which is he said that exposure at a young age often causes this behavior later in life. So if you have struggled with porn, and what he says with porn addicts is often this means, it'd be interesting to think about for yourself or whomever, is that there's often an exposure if they're prepubescent. So this means some sort of, you found a tape or it was a magazine because I'm old, there was some sort of exposure young that changes the wiring of your brain. That he talks about the same sort of a rewiring that happens if you are exposed to substances early as well. And so that's gonna be kind of a link that we're gonna keep coming back to, is how porn addiction is very similar to substance addiction. It's different than in other behavioral addictions, which is what I find myself often struggling with, are these behavioral addictions, but porn addiction itself functions very similar to a drug, which we're gonna talk about a little bit later on. But the connect there that I'm making is that oftentimes there is some sort of an early exposure that links this problem to a later time in life. This next point about porn addiction that I thought was fascinating was that it has nothing to do with sexual appetite. And to me, I think this is why I can have a large sexual appetite and not become addicted to porn, is because those things aren't correlated. What this actually has to do with, from the research that I looked into, what this doctor was sharing, was that porn addiction isn't related to sexual appetite or sexual perversion. It's actually related to a coping mechanism. That people are using porn as to paper over some sort of emotional problem more than anything that has to actually do with sex. This is just sort of the way that it's manifesting. The correlation that this doctor made in porn addiction is more related to meaninglessness, more than any sort of horniness or anything like that. That in the data, at least, it was some fancy something statistical regression, whatever of analysis of all these different studies, that it showed that actually people that felt like they lacked meaning in their life were the ones that ended up watching so much porn. Because the porn addiction, it wasn't like they were there jerking off for 8 hours a day, right? It's almost like it functions, it triggers this thing in your brain that it's an escape else to get out of this meaninglessness. Unfortunately, because there's such a stigma around porn and the stories we tell ourselves about porn, that it becomes this crazy vicious cycle, that the more porn people would watch and use, it would generate more feelings of meaninglessness, of emptiness. And so then they would need to continue to watch more porn. And so there was this sort of crazy vicious cycle going on, that the action that people were doing was generating more of the negative emotions that was causing them to do it in the first place. And to me, I just thought that was a really interesting connection, that had nothing to do with sex per se, it had more to do with finding purpose. And when the doctor talked about how he was able to bring people out of this porn addiction, the big piece was to find some sort of a purpose in your life, that you have to have something that you're excited about. If porn is this sort of black hole of distraction and gives you these little dopamine hits to take you away from whatever that pain is in your life, you need to replace that with something else. And so what he talks about is kind of weaning people off of this porn addiction is by filling that hole with some sort of other piece in their life that brings them purpose, that makes them feel meaning. So that way, that's not the first place that they want to go, is just to paper over the bad feelings, to make the bad feelings go away. So I just thought that was super interesting in terms of the actual inspiration behind porn use and the motivation that it wasn't even correlated to sex. The last thing that I learned about porn addiction that I thought was fascinating is the way that porn manifests in our brain and our behavior as a drug. That this is more than gambling or maybe sexual deviant behavior or addictive to video games, that there's a certain high that happens when the dopamine, the way that it reacts is very similar to a drug, to a substance, whether it's cocaine or an amphetamine or something, that it's a very targeted use and it's very immediate in how that can manifest and kind of change people's brains as well. When we talk about being a recovering alcoholic, you say, oh, I'm a recovering alcoholic. People say, oh, wow, good for you, you go. When people say, oh, I'm recovering from porn, it's kind of weird. There's still the stigma around it, but they're almost one and the same. That the mechanism that we're using to cope when using a substance, cocaine, whatever it is, porn functions in a similar way of this hedonic treadmill that you often need more. Same way you would with a substance. There's a certain level that you get to, and then you need more to feel that same sort of thing. If you've ever used porn and used porn a lot in my teens, I wouldn't say I was addicted, but I definitely used it a lot more. I was just super frisky in my teens. I would find that normal sex doesn't cut it for you anymore. You got to start diving deep into just like weird rabbit holes that before you know it, you're in like Japanese cartoons, right? And so the same way that it works as a substance, porn, if someone is a recovering porn addict or something like that, to respect that because it functions in the same way as a drug. And I think we give a lot of props to people that are in 12-step, etc., and overlook porn addiction often as it's like, man, this person's weird, it's a perversion, or they're super horny or something, which is actually not true at all. That it's actually, think of a recovering porn addict as someone who's done the work to get over a substance because it functions for us, our neurochemistry and our addictive behavior in a very similar way. So I hope that was helpful, y'all. I know at least for me that this was a really powerful thing about how to approach porn going forwards. Also not demonizing people that do use porn or that have been addicted to porn. And also it helps me have a lot of empathy, I think, for folks that are going through something like this, just because it changed my perception on porn and porn usage completely. So hopefully that helps, or at least enlightens you a little bit in terms of what your brain is doing. And thanks for tuning in. As always, and I'll check you on the next one. Peace.